Hey folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is Searching for the Sea Peoples. So our key questions for today. Who were the Sea Peoples? And what questions about them can we answer? I also want to touch on why scholars have been so obsessed with the Sea Peoples. It is basically a debate that will never go away. And there are specific reasons for that. The Sea Peoples will also play a bit of a role in the topic of our next lecture, which is the Late Bronze Age collapse. So keep in mind what we cover in this one, as it will be relevant to the next one as well. All right, where did this all begin? So the term the Sea People comes from the Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in 1881. And he comes up with it as an umbrella term that refers to groups mentioned in various inscriptions and papyrus texts. And the actual list is fluid depending on what text you're talking about. If we're going to combine them all together, you basically have the Luka, the Sheridan, the Shekelesh, the Teresh, the Ekwesh, the Denyen, a group called either the Sikil or the Tieker, the Wesh-Esh, and the Peliset peoples. Now, they are seen as either the driving force behind or simply a major consequence of the crisis of the Late Bronze Age. So again, this is the topic of our next lecture, and this is a period where many of the major civilizations or empires of the Near East disintegrated or transformed into something else. Now, archaeologists in the 20th century created what I'm going to call the Sea People narrative. And this is the idea that migrating groups from the Western Aegean, perhaps displaced by the end of the Mycenaean palaces, started to attack other civilizations such as Egypt. Egypt is where we get most of our information for the so-called Sea Peoples, although Hittite sources do provide some as well. Specifically, the Sea Peoples are held responsible for the collapse of the Hittite Empire, for the fall of Cyprus, for the destruction of smaller kingdoms in Syria, Palestine, and other parts of the Levant. Now, sometimes they're actually blamed for the end of the Mycenaean palaces, so cause and effect get switched around depending on who's talking about this narrative. But the narrative itself is the product of a particular Eurocentric scholarly perspective. And this perspective was finding resonances between the Late Bronze Age collapse and the political situation in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 19th and 20th centuries. So, we do know there were peoples active doing things that, the Egyptians and the Hittites didn't approve of in this period. But what the Sea People narrative does is it oversimplifies what was probably a very complex reality. And archaeology, in particular, is still in the process of trying to uncover what that reality was. And the simple fact is, we don't really know who the Sea Peoples were. We don't know where they came from. We don't know what they specifically did, and whether or not we should even be using that term. When you speak of the Sea Peoples and their invasions, it implies this great wave of movement. I mean, is that true? Or were there many different groups doing different things for different reasons at different times? And so this narrative could possibly simply be dumbing down something that's much more interesting. Now, it's always exceptionally dicey to use sources written by literate peoples about peoples who did not produce their own sources. You never have the perspective of the subject that way. This is sometimes called proto-history, and we'll be revisiting the problems with that concept quite often in the course. So, to give you an example, the names that writers use for these peoples may not be what they called themselves. In fact, they're almost certainly not. The deviation between the historical record and the reality often grows only more complex from there. It is safe to say that when these centralized Bronze Age states collapsed, we did see greater localism. We did see the emergence of what we would probably term ethnic groups. The only thing I would point out is that ethnicity in the pre-modern world is very different than what we think of as ethnicity. For them, it was often a choice of group identity. It's not necessarily anything more substantive than that. And ethnicity in the pre-modern world is always quite fluid. And even if it hadn't been, I mean, there's a difference between saying we have the emergence of all these new ethnic groups and we have an age of invasions. Now, our main information for the Sea peoples comes from texts and inscriptions from the reigns of two particular pharaohs, Ptah and Ramses III, and respectively they rule in the 13th and 12th century BCE. Now, Ramses' mortuary temple at Medinet Habu actually has whole scenes related to the Sea people carved. There's one particularly important inscription there, and I'm just going to read it. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amor. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward towards Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Philistines, the Chitzeru, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the ends as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Our plans will succeed. So you'll note there are only 5 peoples mentioned there, and when you add the other Egyptian sources, you have the 9. Incidentally, the Philistines are the Peliset. That's the one identification that has been pretty confidently made. There is a problem with Egyptian script when we're talking about names, because Egyptian script records only consonants. Cuneiform, on the other hand, records syllables. So, when you compare, for instance, an Egyptian text on the Sea peoples with a Hittite text on the Sea peoples, how do you make sure that the name in one script is the same as the name in another? Hieroglyphs also are missing a sign that regularly denotes the sound L, which makes things even more complex in reconstructing what those names actually were. So this is one of the things that makes it almost impossible to identify these groups with particular regions. It's almost always speculative. Again, the only one that could be considered even reasonably successful were the Peliset, who were identified as the Philistines. Now, if you read that inscription only on the surface, you would think that you were dealing with some grand coalition. Was that really the case? Now, it's not impossible, and yet I would recommend great caution in that interpretation. I mean, we do know that these groups did attack Egypt. There are at least 2 battles attested in the textual evidence during Ramses' reign, for instance. But historians disagree whether or not the texts are telling the truth. I mean, did these 2 battles both happen? There are theories that maybe they both did, maybe one did, maybe there were in fact many battles, and the inscriptions at the temple simply simplify the narrative and sort of telescope all of these smaller conflicts into big epic battles. And after all, Ramses was not the first to encounter them. So 26 years earlier, Ptah, in the 5th year of his reign, fought a war against the Libyans. And the Libyans, the texts tell us, were accompanied by contingents of Sea peoples, specifically groups of Ekwesh, Teresh, Luki, Shardana, and Shekelesh. They were either allies or mercenaries. It's hard to say. It's also impossible to say what they were doing in Libya. Now, there are a few other key texts, but if you compare the respective lists of Sea peoples that they give to each other, there's not a huge amount of overlap. So I'm trusting that you're beginning to see how our sources, our literary sources, raise as many questions as they do giving answers. One of the only commonalities between them is that all of these peoples are described as northerners from the Isles or from the sea. So, just to be specific in how difficult it is to pinpoint origins. So, the Luki. We know of the Luki from Hittite inscriptions as well as Egyptian. They are seen as notorious pirates. The current semi-consensus idea is that they were originally from Anatolia. They are actually recorded in some of the Amarna letters as having raided Cyprus. They are also mentioned as having fought beside the Hittites against the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh in 1286 BCE. Now, the evidence for their existence in Anatolia is just textual. There have not been any archaeological remains clearly associated with them. And that is very common. Again, we just cannot connect them to anything on the ground. Now, the Shardana appear in the Amarna letters as well, but they, in turn, are actually serving in an Egyptian garrison at Byblos. So, are they mercenaries? Were they resettled there as part of a treaty? Other texts show us them fighting both for and against Egypt. Now, they do not have a homeland given in any of these texts, but we do see them depicted in Egyptian art. They are depicted as wearing horned helmets and carrying round shields. So there is a similarity between some of the artistic representations of the Shardana. Now, some scholars, when they sit down to try and guess where they came from, talk about Sardinia, so the island, because Shardana, Sardinia, it's very thin though. I mean, even if there is a connection, they could have settled on Sardinia after being defeated by the Egyptians. The name of the island could have come from them. So, this is tricky because, specifically, you never are sure what comes first, the name of the people or the name of the place. Does one give the name to the other, or is it vice versa? Chicken and the egg question, basically. Now, one Egyptian text says that the Shardana and the Weshesh were brought as captives to Egypt by Ramses III, that they were settled there and taxed in garrisons. And this is interesting because it raises some parallels to later uses of so-called barbarian peoples by Mediterranean civilizations. Now, archaeologists have tried very hard to connect Sardinia to the Shardana. There are circular buildings from the Bronze Age made out of stone. They're called neraji on Sardinia, and they are sometimes linked to the Shardana because there are similar ruins in Iron Age villages in the Levant that might have been settled by the Shardana. You notice my heavy use of might and may and that sort of thing. It's all very speculative. All right, the Teresh only appear in text during the time of Merenptah. They may have been another Anatolian group. Now, there is, I don't want to get into specific detail trying to show how the names link together, but suffice to say, some scholars have tried to draw a parallel between the Teresh and a later group. And the later group are also linked by Herodotus to the Etruscans. And, I don't know. I get very tired of this game playing with linguistic evidence, quite frankly, because there's never anything behind it. There's just a similarity in names. And I'm sorry, there are only a limited number of sounds the human mouth can make. I don't know that we should be basing any kind of historical theory on a similarity between names. And in this case, with the Etruscans, they just wanted to link this one group of sea peoples to the Etruscans because that would be cool. Sorry, I'm sounding a bit bitter. I get a little frustrated with this. This sort of linguistic evidence can be really badly misused. Sometimes for political reasons, so I'm very leery of it, actually. Now, the Shekelesh are mentioned by Hittite royal letters to the king of Ugarit. They are noted in Egyptian texts starting in Merenptah's reign. And again, scholars have pointed out there is a similarity between some of the different renderings of their name and the original rendering of the name for Sicily. Again, however, no archaeological evidence, and even if the linkage exists, which came first? Now, the Ekwesh are interesting. They are only mentioned by Merenptah, only mentioned during Merenptah's reign. Now, it has sometimes been claimed that they are in fact the Achaeoi. Those would be the Mycenaeans. But again, we've got the problem of transliteration here. Other scholars have linked them to the people called the Ahiyawa by the Hittites, who are also sometimes linked to the Mycenaeans. This is a particularly fierce debate. There are some significant logical problems with this, however, because of course Greece is also part of the Late Bronze Age collapse. So, are the Mycenaeans destroying their own palace system? What's going on here? It's not a debate that's going to end anytime soon because, again, we just simply don't have the evidence. Now, the Czech crew, a little bit more evidence from them. We have an interesting text from 1100 BC that lists them between the Shardana and the Philistines. They also appear in another text that tells the adventures of an Egyptian official traveling in the Levant. He mentions Czech crew towns in Syria. So it is possible that they may have been resettled there after their defeat by Ramses. So the specific town he mentions, Dor, has been excavated, and its material culture links to a group that archaeologists call the Sikels, who are sometimes linked to both Sicily and the Shekelesh. So here's an interesting question. Are the Checker just another name for the Shekelesh? Should they be treated as two separate groups at all? Now, the Denyen, who are sometimes called the Danuna, are mentioned by the Hittites as being in southeast Turkey. That is assuming that linkage is correct as well. But they are also linked by some to Homer's Danans, or the Danoi, which is, again, an alternate name for the Achaeans. I don't know why so many scholars really badly want some of these peoples to be Mycenaean, but they really, really do. Now, one scholar has noted a similarity between how the name is represented and how the name of another earlier group, the Tanaja, are written in hieroglyphs. So this is how he identifies them with mainland Greece and the Mycenaeans. So that's not even like a sound-alike similarity. That's just a similarity in how the name is literally written. Now again, the palimpsest, or the one concrete identification that we have, this is because we have a significant amount of archaeological evidence for them, their pottery in particular. The pottery is seen as a sort of a scaled-back version of Mycenaean pottery. And of course, there are scholars that point at that and say, oh, they're Greek, they're Mycenaean, yay. But no, you don't need to be of the same people, quote unquote, to mimic their pottery, right? This is one of the problems. You can't point at a pot and say, oh, this is like these other pots, so they're of the same ethnicity. Maybe they just like the pot, right? I'm sorry. I shouldn't be mocking attempts to make connections here, but it's just from a historical standpoint, it always seems so thin. All right, I'm having a good time with this lecture, guys. I'm not going to lie. This is one of the reasons I added it this year. All right, so the last group, the Weshesh, and we know virtually nothing about them. Some of the potential identifications that have come up are with the Wilusa from Hittite texts, and the Wilusa are often identified with another group called the Ilios, who are identified as Trojans. And this connection is purely linguistic, guys. There is no actual archaeology behind it. I think too many scholars have just a little bit of Heinrich Schliemann in them, and they want to link things back to Troy whenever possible. Now, I'm hoping you can see from this quick survey just how sketchy all of this is, how little evidence we have for who these peoples were, and how fundamentally impossible it is to ever be certain. These are not debates that are going to be settled. I don't think these are debates that are going to be settled, even if, great breakthroughs in archaeology are made. Simply because it's just, there's not enough to be sure. There is no way to connect the literary and the archaeological firmly because we have so little from the literary side of things. All right, so what can we actually do from a logical standpoint to sort out what we know about these quote unquote invasions? We can reason out a few likely possibilities about how these peoples were involved in the military events that are mentioned in the Egyptian texts. So, for example, the attacks during Merenptah's reign. The sea peoples that were involved in these attacks almost certainly would have sailed to Libya to join the Libyans there. They would not have been able to travel to Libya overland because the Egyptians had numerous fortresses in the Nile Delta and along the coast. This would have caused more of an impact, and this impact would likely have been reflected in the sources that we have. And the reason we know this is that, in contrast, Ramses' experience of these attacks, we do see it reflected that the sea peoples were involved both by sea and by land. This is why they have the camp in Amor, for instance. And one of the inscriptions at Medinet Habu tells us that the land contingent was accompanied by women, children, and all of their possessions were carried with them in carts drawn by oxen. The carts are actually represented in the relief carvings at the temple. This is really interesting because this suggests something that's not perhaps a standard sort of raid. There's something more going on here. Are they, in fact, trying to move their entire people, their entire tribe? Now, that being said, we also have to keep in mind that if there is a possibility, for instance, that they're nomadic, they may have moved with all of their people as a matter of course. We don't know enough to be sure. Now, what we can suggest is that there is a connection with other military events going on elsewhere at this time. We have a letter from the king of Ugarit in Syria to the king of Cyprus from just before Ramses' experience, where he talks about how the enemy arrived in 7 ships and began attacking his cities and, quote, doing harm to the land. This may have been the beginning of this broader campaign. It does lie both in terms of the description of how these attacks happened and with the timing of Ramses' inscriptions. It's still speculative, but it's speculative in a way that's a little bit more grounded, at least in the literary tradition. Now, these constant disclaimers are annoying, I know, but I'm hoping it's really coming clear why you can't have a simple narrative about the sea peoples. The other thing to remember about the Egyptian sources is that they are very selective. Merenptah's reign tend to highlight Merenptah's documents tend to highlight only the Shekelesh, and they group other sea peoples as foreign countries. Now, it could be as simple as trying to save space in an inscription, but then why emphasize the Shekelesh? What's special about them? There's a similar issue with Ramses' documents. They only provide a full list of sea peoples involved in the action twice. Elsewhere, they tend to mention only the Chekru and the Peliset. Now, it is possibly because the Chekru and the Peliset are standing in as sort of the best-known peoples of these larger groups. Are they just simply representative of a bigger confederation? Or something else entirely going on? We also have to wonder about the role of propaganda. I mean, in both Merenptah's case and Ramses' case, the documents and the inscriptions exist to burnish the reputation of the pharaoh. So we have to ask ourselves, can we actually take them at face value? Now, we can say that military action had to have happened in some form. It's very unlikely that these conflicts were simply invented. Propaganda is not any good if it's not based on a core of truth, after all. So we can assume, for instance, that yes, some of these peoples cooperated with the Libyans during Merenptah's reign. Also that Ramses likely faced a fairly serious threat. Now, I've mentioned the relief carvings, and you've seen a few examples of them in the images on the slides. So there is pictorial evidence that Egyptian forces after Ramses were accompanied by those garbed in a way that is identified in earlier representations as sea peoples. So both the relief carvings and these later images show soldiers accompanying Egyptian forces that are wearing feathered headdresses and horned helmets. So are these the groups that settled in Egypt as part of concluding the conflict? That said, it's easy to put a lot of weight on the visual depictions of the battles from the period of Ramses' reign in particular. The reason that we got to be careful about that is that the relief carvings are influenced by the ideology of pharaonic rule. So Egypt is represented as the center of the universe. The king is naturally represented as crushing foreigners. There is significant animal symbolism. So at Medinet Habu, for instance, we have scenes of the pharaoh's lion hunt juxtaposed with scenes of the sea people being defeated. And, this is actually saying rather a lot. If you're likening your enemy to a lion, he's your enemy, but you're still kind of admiring him in a way. Now, that being said, I think we can draw some specifics about their military abilities from this pictorial evidence, or at least tentatively we can. So they're depicted as using chariots as well as infantry. Why would the Egyptians depict them as using chariots if they didn't? Like, what would be the purpose of that? I'm sure that is a possibility as well, but again, propaganda has to be rooted in truth, or it's not going to be convincing. The sea peoples are also depicted as fleeing in relatively good order as well, which suggests, did they have a degree of military discipline? Some of the relief carvings actually cover the preparations that the Egyptians made for the naval battle, and this may have reflected the strength of the sea people at sea. The inscriptions talk about preparing the delta, quote, like a strong wall with warships, galleys, and coasters. You don't do that if you're not facing a fairly serious threat. All right, so I hope you're seeing that the sea people are just a tricky topic. We cannot just uncritically repeat the traditional narrative about them, because it is impossible to fully reconstruct who they were, where they came from, what they did. It is entirely possible that the sea peoples is simply an Egyptian umbrella term that oversimplifies a much more complex reality. It's also possible that the dramatic accounts of the major battles are historical fiction, so based on fact, but jazzed up to make the pharaoh in question look better. So I honestly think the way that scholars have sort of flailed around trying to identify the sea peoples is a bit concerning, because there needs to be some sort of rigor in how the questions, both textual and archaeological, are approached. I mean, how much weight are you going to give, for instance, to different types of evidence? So narrative inscriptions versus art versus similarities in names. And we also just have to accept that the chances are probably better than good that whoever these people were, they are just going to remain a mystery, that we are never going to be able to answer these questions, and that historians will probably continue to debate them until the end of time. All right, so I hope my giggling over pots didn't come across as too annoying, but this is a really interesting topic, so I'm glad I did it. Thanks very much, guys, and we'll be back with the Late Bronze Age collapse.